Blog Talk Radio.
Hello, and welcome to Virtues of Peace. My name is Hope May, and I'm so happy to have Taylor Ackerman.
Hello.
And Randy Olson.
Greetings.
So we are here, and the topic of today's show is Organize the World, an idea central to the Peace Through Law movement. This is our second show. We launched this podcast on May 18th, an historic day because that was the original Peace Day, widely celebrated in the United States to educate people about the, quote, New World Order and the new international court that was created pursuant to the 1899 Hague Peace Conference to replace armed conflict with a nonviolent method of dispute settlement called international arbitration. This is an incredibly important story with many important ideas and personalities, and this podcast is aimed at excavating these ideas and personalities of the Peace Through Law movement. Just to recap briefly from last time, we began with a definition of peace from Jane Addams, who defines peace not simply as the absence of war, but as the unfolding of worldwide processes making for the nurture of human life. And we said that that is an important definition because it is not simply negative. That is, a lot of people, when they think about the peace movement, equate it with the anti-war movement. But Jane Addams' definition shows us that there's something for which we need to be working, laboring, constructing, developing. And that brings us to this show, Organize the World. Again, the idea is work needs to be done, organization needs to be done, and this is something that does not happen in a generation. I want to just also note that today, May 29th, 2020, is the United States is encountering some difficulties with COVID-19 and the death of George Floyd. And as I was thinking about this show, I was reminded of the 1904 International Peace Congress that met in Boston. I have thrown up the proceedings of that meeting on our show resources page at virtuesofpeace.com. At that meeting in Boston, Edwin Meade, who wrote the pamphlet that grounds our discussion today, and his wife, Lucia Ames Meade, were present. And fittingly, Edwin Meade, I think he was the president of the Committee on Organization for the International Peace Congress, and his wife, Lucia Ames Meade, was the chair or president of the Committee on Propaganda. And in her report, which you can read, she says, look, we are supposed to be talking about a symbol, a peace flag, but given the events in the world, this seems to be a waste of energy because we have the Russo-Japanese War, and she lists a number of conflicts. And so we're going to table the discussion about a peace flag because our time should not be spent on colors and symbols and so forth. And as I was thinking about this show, that struck me because here we are talking about international organization, because that's really the subject of Edwin Meade's essay, when in fact we have a lot of problems domestically and even, I would say, personally. And I want to say that our aim, and what we talked about last time, is how all of these different levels are interrelated, that the international is not to be separated from the national, and the international is not to be separated from the individual, that all of these different areas are to be organized, and that what happens in one affects what happens in another. I want to flag Marcus Aurelius for for speaking about that. We have some shows on Marcus Aurelius from Ethics Talk a ways back if you want to listen to those shows. But indeed, we're going to start talking about international organization. And so if you read the show description, there is a pamphlet. The pamphlet is of 3 essays, all by Edwin Mead. And the first one is called Organize the World. The second one is on Immanuel Kant. The third one is on Charles Sumner. All important essays, but we start at the beginning with Organize the World. And Taylor, you have found a sentence, a passage that you would like to talk about. This is on page 11 of the essay. So please read that, and then we'll talk about that, and you can begin.
So Mead wrote, "The world is to be organized not to keep nations peaceful in orderly arbitrament and protected separateness, but for constructive and cooperative life. That life will come as nations see that they are not their own, but all of them members, one of another, with common inheritances, with common obligations, and with a common destiny." And so I think it really follows that idea of it's not just about that negative form of peace, about, protect or respecting nation sovereignty at all costs, just not entering war. It's about a much more constructive and cooperative form of peace, because there are so many challenges that disrupt peace, and they can't be addressed by countries separately. And I think going off of what you said earlier, many of our challenges are global, even on a national or domestic level. And we need to only look at like COVID, right, a pandemic, to see that. And so I think the article actually earlier on the, I think it was page 4, highlighted that we're all connected, and that it's not just it was very forward-looking because it focused on how with technology we're increasingly connected. What impacts one person, one place, impacts someone else elsewhere. And that was very forward-looking because we think about the internet, we think about social media, and what any individual can do can have enormous repercussions elsewhere.
Randy, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I can't help but think about how networks work and how each of us now are living in a time when we're each nodes in this enormous, and so each of our personal actions has this rippling outward effect on everyone around us, and they are all nodes and networks that ripple out to everyone around them, and it's very, very fast that we reach, more or less the entire globe with every one of our choices, every one of our actions, and so the passage that Taylor shared reminded me of our conversation last week, where it's like this duty of the individual to become educated about international relations and understand themselves as an international citizen and what international obligations are as a single individual, because until that becomes instantiated inside of the individual, the capacity for international cooperation is missing a foundational piece.
Right, and if you're listening and you want to comment on this, you can call in 516-387-1449, 516-387-1449, and indeed, this idea that we're all part of a system. Once again, let me go back to who I mentioned earlier, Marcus Aurelius. Here's a quote from his Meditations. "We have come into the world to work together, like feet, like hands, like eyelids, like the rows of upper and lower teeth. To work against one another is to oppose nature." And when we're talking about this cooperation and this network, I also want to throw into that these voices, these stories, these labors from the past, because there could be something that is said 2,000 years ago that is really impacting someone today. So it's not just about the voices that are living, the stories that are occurring now, but things that have happened in the past are also interacting with us in the present. Taylor, do you want to add to? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Randy. Go ahead.
Well, sorry. I just wanted to take that as an opportunity to build on, right? I wanted to build on that and build on this idea that the experiences that were 2,000 years ago, those experiences are still part of our collective mechanism for learning that has to grow. And like there's this slow scaling up that's been occurring, such that 200 years ago, the idea of a global organized, like a global organized government was far out of sight, but that's not so far away now. And so the language that was used at the time to indicate like what scale of organization was necessary has grown, and we can use these historical documents as a mechanism through which we appreciate that scaling up of the world. So I think that now is an appropriate place to share another passage from the pamphlet by Mead.
Mm-hmm.
It's on page 5 of that pamphlet for anyone who is looking. The passage reads, "Let no man think of himself any longer in the first place as a New England man, or as a New Yorker, or as a Virginian, but all of us as Americans." Now that was the vision and message of George Washington, and that insight and that law, coming to petty, prejudiced, jealous, and disordered states, put an end to chaos and brought peace, prosperity, strength, largeness of life, and an ever-broadening horizon. Let no man think of himself any longer in the first place as an American, as an Englishman, as a Spaniard, or as a Frenchman, a German or a Russian, but all men in the first place as citizens of the world. That is the message which has thundered in the ears of Washington's America in this eventful and surprising year, as it was never done before. Now, it's amazing because that was written more than 100 years ago, and it seems awfully true today. I could continue, but I kind of cut Taylor off earlier, so I'd like to offer her an opportunity to step in.
Yeah, no, I think that's very relevant to also the external organization idea, this common inheritances idea. I know back there in Mead, he spoke about how earlier these philosophers thought it wouldn't be possible to have a democracy as large as the U.S. But as it became more connected with technology, on both coasts they really saw themselves as Americans. They were impacted by the same things. They kind of had that common inheritance. And the democracy that of that large really became practical and necessary. And I think it's the same idea now. As we've become more interconnected, as we've become more enlightened, it's really important for us to organize together because we are all really the same. We have these common obligations, these same sort of goals.
Randy, did you want to respond?
Yeah, just very briefly. It's amazing to me because we're at a cool point in history where we have to begin to have conversations about scaling things up again. There's been some news about things that SpaceX has been working on with the goal of becoming multiplanetary. And so the idea of being a citizen of the world won't even be large enough anymore. And we're going to have to be increasingly conscientious about the scale at which we take organization and put the spirit of peace within it.
So I'll add a quote. This is not from Edwin Mead's essay. This is actually from a speech that his soon-to-be, like when this speech was given, she was not his wife, but this speech was given at the meeting at which Lucia Ames met Edwin Mead, and this was at the Lake Mohonk International Arbitration Conference. The proceedings are on the show resources page. And just a little bit about Lucia, because this is a power couple, and I think they deserve some definitely more time than 60 minutes that we're giving them today. But Lucia Ames Mead was the president of the Massachusetts Suffrage Association, and she was working on women's suffrage and then was brought into the peace movement. And this was her first public speech that she gave when she was brought into the peace movement. She says, and this is very similar to the quote that Randy just read, she says, "We are not, first of all, Americans. We are, first of all, human beings. We are, first of all, God's children, and we have identical interests with all God's children all over the face of the earth. That is what we need to feel, and that is what we need to teach. We must teach patriotism in a new way." And she goes on, but the very last sentence of her speech, which is actually from a poem that she quotes, is this: "In the gain or loss of one race, all the rest have equal claim." So this, again, the same idea that when someone gains, we all gain. When someone loses, we all lose. And she is really in this speech. So we're talking about, scaling up to interplanetary. But I mean, given what's happening today, okay, with George Floyd, and let's just not even, there's, a litany of things that we can discuss. And again, as I said, like, what I could imagine someone saying, what business do we have talking about, scaling up when we can't organize ourselves very locally? So, Randy, you have this other quote, if you could please read that you get from page 6 of Mead's essay.
Yeah, it's alarmingly similar to what you just said. On page 6 of the pamphlet that we've been referring to, Mead says, "The problem with us is that we have not organized ourselves." And it's amazing because, at the end of the day, there's something very simple that seems to get overlooked all the time, and it's that, nations are made up of people. And if the people are all bad, then the nation is bad, and that's a super, super oversimplification of it. But it serves to point to the fact that, when the individual takes care of themselves, it makes it possible for the nation to take care of itself, and makes it possible to organize at a higher scale, but not the other way, right? We can't just put the world together top down and then expect that people are going to fall into line like dominoes and become, more developed. That's just not how it works. And, the bottom line is, I've had the luxury of studying a number of historical personalities who prove without any doubt that one person has the capacity to radically change the world. And that happened first and foremost because the beginning portion of their life involved this radical organization of their own values, so that when they became tested by the world, when trouble showed up, they were able to respond intuitively in the way that was noble. And that is what ripples outwards into social change. And the social change that comes from that would not be possible without the prior internal organization of that person's values. And so that's fundamentally the purpose of education.
Mm. Taylor?
Yeah, I think when it comes to international organization, it doesn't work if individually and domestically we aren't organized as well. I think sometimes the problem is, I guess when it comes to the idea of interconnectedness, we are so interconnected now that when I think of, hate speech on the internet can fuel someone's racist acts elsewhere, and, cause domestic terrorism in another country or really initiate it. So I think it's very important that we consider how if our own country isn't organized properly, we're not really going to be able to participate, and it can have damaging effects elsewhere.
Mm. Yeah, and
one more thing, actually. Oh, sorry. I just wanted to share a story because we all actually experienced an example of this together that is amazing to me. A few years ago, there was an event occurring within the Peace Palace that Hope was organizing, and at that event, there was a person there who I won't name, but that person was literally stealing things from the table. And the impact of her actions on the event was to effectively add a bunch of, it really slowed down the way that the rest of the cogs in the wheel were able to operate. And it's so amazing to see the negative example, right? It's what happens when there's a false organization within an individual at the higher scale. It makes everything slow down and makes everything more complicated. And when we, I don't want to emphasize the negative there, but it's we all had that visceral, direct experience, and we got to see how it unfolded.
Yeah, I wanted to say that, the last show I mentioned page 1, volume 1, issue 1 of the American Journal of International Law, which is the need for a public understanding. The title is The Need for a Public Understanding of International Law, and that this education piece of the individual is an essential plank of organization, individually, domestically, and internationally. I also want to add to that, because we're talking about, scaling up and getting these other pieces sufficiently organized so that the, quote, system, and by the way, Marcus Aurelius talks about this orderly system of which we are all a part, and we're all designed to work for it in harmony. But the second essay in this pamphlet called Organize the World is about Kant's ideas, the philosopher Immanuel Kant, and it's called Kant's Eternal Peace. Sometimes Kant's work on peace is sometimes translated as perpetual peace. But in that essay, Kant says, in order for international organization to occur, each country has to adopt a republican constitution. And Kant is very careful to separate a republican constitution from democracy, in the sense that there must be a separation between the executive branch and the legislative branch. So the people cannot be in control of the legislative branch necessarily, because that would be a conflict of interest, he says. So I just wanted to flag this other idea. We've mentioned education of the individual as an essential plank, and education along cosmopolitan lines so that the individual is aware of his or her membership in this world commonwealth, as the Stoics spoke about it 2,000 years ago. But also this idea of a republican constitution domestically needs to be a part of that. And Kant says the reason why that has to be a part of it, and the reason why that will lead to peace is, number one, it's premised on the freedom and equality of all people, and that's a precondition. And number two, people will not be willing to wage war. They will not be willing to shoulder the burdens of it. And when you have power taken away from people, and it's just the sovereign who's waging war, and he is sending other people to war, he doesn't bear the brunt. He doesn't bear the burdens of it. So he's very easy to send his minions out to do his bidding. And I think Kant says something like his table fancies are not affected at all. So I just wanted to mention that, and that also, Randy, and I'm jumping around a bit, but you found a quote on page 7 that is somewhat related to this idea. Could you read that quote? This page 7 is from Edwin Means' Organize the World essay.
Sure. The question is not one of competence to dominate and rule. It is the greater question of political morality and fidelity to the democratic idea and the democratic method in the world. Mm-hmm. So, it's not about whether it's possible or not for us to create systems that keep people in check or not. It's more like, are we capable? Do we have the ability to build and organize systems that are built on the kinds of values that we can rationally, accept? We can make these sufficiently clear ideas on paper, but are we able to put those into practice so that our organizations out in the world, our institutions, and the way those things actually function map on to the ideas that they were built to represent? And there's one idea at the heart of it that I want to emphasize, and it's no organizational structure of any kind capable of operating without truth and promise keeping as a foundational pillar. And I know that this is an enormous thing that we could talk about, and perhaps will at another time, but if the people who we elect in order to represent our interests are doing the things that they say they're going to do, society is going to operate in a much clearer, much cleaner, much more organized way. And that goes for a republic or a democracy or any other kind of government. As long as people are doing what they say they're going to do, and then we have open, free conversations about what things are going to occur, then the concept of democracy can occur. But without those pieces, it's there's something else going on.
I mean, I have things to say, but Taylor, you've been quiet. You want to jump in?
Yeah, I think when we go into international organizations, they're often criticized as being undemocratic. But if the states that are comprising these international institutions are themselves democratic, then it really can push the voices of people forward, and build really a more democratic world. I guess the problem would be when individuals are, using these sort of organizations and trying to organize the world for more menacing, more power, greed, for their own sort of self-serving interests. We don't benefit from that. So I guess it's organization, domestically, internationally, personally, for the right reasons, not just for structure and order.
Yeah. Again, if you want to call in, if you have something to add, 516-387-1449. On this conversation about democracy, indeed I like promise-keeping, truth-telling, yes. And I also want to say that I think crucial for democracy is critical thinking. and, you know, the ability to detect a fallacious argument, the ability to follow, you know, a line of reasoning that is more than a tweet. It's you know, concerning to me that we don't really see so much complex argument in our discourse today, and I think that that's something that has to be developed as a capacity in a person. There's a kind of innate sense for it, but it needs to be developed. And you know, we hear about fake news, and there's just a lot of untruths that we have, and unless the individual is willing and able to figure out the truth for him or herself, it's not clear what we're making our decisions on. So I wanted to add that as well. And so to the point, Taylor, about, well, if we have so-called democracies represented in an international organization, if it's not a, you know, healthy democracy, and if the people are not really engaged in a rational debate, then it's kind of doomed. So this goes back to the organization and education piece, which again is like, and by the way, if you're interested in that 1897 speech by Lucia Ames, she does talk about like education has to change, and it's so interesting. In her speech, she's like, look, the people who are being educated about history, she says, are women. It's so odd. I had to read this several times. Like, women know about history, but men in high school are not really learning history. I don't know like the basis of these claims that she's making, but she says this, and she says this is not good because you need history to do proper statecraft, and you need this right kind of education. She says true patriotism. So it all starts there, and her speech is about that. So, Randy?
Yeah, two ideas come to mind for me. The first has to do with some of the progress that we've made as a species with regard to providing education to more and more people. I know that the UN's Education for All initiative under Ban Ki-moon brought the number of people around the planet who are being educated like up an enormous amount. And I don't know the number off the top of my head, but it's like the rate of like education has been soaring. And as part of that initiative, they were completely aware of the fact that a single educational model cannot be happily piped down every community on the planet. And there's a challenge for how to implement such lofty goals that we're learning very seriously how to do and how to improve. But, and this is where it gets very strange, the question becomes, what history do we need to know? Because I think that it's going to be different based on where we're living and based on the contents of our lives. And yet, there are certain stories, there are certain sets of information which make up a complete framework, a normative framework for understanding the growth and development of the globalized world that we now inhabit. And so now there's this amazing tipping point between, well, are we really just going to force everybody to learn the same thing? That seems a little totalitarian. And on the other hand, it's like, well, nobody needs to actually bother learning about the same things, which is this like subjectivism and, relativism nonsense. And so finding that middle ground is so so very much part of our current life task.
Hmm. Taylor?
Yeah, I think when we talk about learning history, it reminds me often of transitional justice and the importance of recognizing after a conflict what happened. And there is a problem with manipulation of textbooks a lot of times in most countries, history textbooks, so students don't get the full picture. I remember my U.S. history textbook maybe had a paragraph about slavery. In Japan, they took out all the references to comfort women in history textbooks. And so I think when we talk about organization, it really does have to be like a complete rational kind of objective attempt. It can't just be sort of a protective way for the nation to secure its own narrative. It has to really be international in scope.
I'd like to jump in and do a shameless plug again for the idea of truth, because there's this concept of a lie of omission that is something that I'm amazed to know how many people I encounter every day who don't already have this as part of their internal lexicon. But it's possible to lie by not including information. And so a history book that does not sufficiently explain certain kinds of atrocities are effectively lying about what has occurred, and that cannot continue if we're trying to actually organize our citizens, if we're trying to truly educate people. It can't be built on lies. So anyway, that's my plug.
Well, I would like to add to that plug and say the whole point of this podcast, the work that we have done, all three of us, positive history. I mean, and this is an idea that goes back to Lucia Ames, to Cora de Brazza, and these other foot soldiers of the peace movement, that actually it's not just about including stories of atrocity, what I call atrocity history. You also have to include these stories of international cooperation, these, high points of humanity, what we call positive history. And if you don't include that, that's also a lie. And indeed, it's not just stories about horrible things that are kept from us. It's also stories about, how did we learn about The Hague and the Peace Palace? We all have been there, all of us on this call, and the role of the United States Peace Movement, the Peace Day. Right? So I want to. I don't. Anybody can chime into that.
Yeah, definitely. You've sparked my memory, in fact, of something very specific, and by happenstance, I had it sitting next to me. So there's a quote from Bertha von Suttner's diaries. It was made on July 29th at the close of the Hague Peace Conferences, and in her diary she wrote that this is the first time since history began to be written that the representatives of the governments come together to find a means for securing a permanent, genuine peace for the world. Whether or not this means will be found in the conference that is to be opened today had nothing to do with the magnitude of the event. In the endeavor lies the new direction. And I love that. It's like when we look into the past, we can get these pockets of just pure wisdom where like people who were there, who were part of the organization of these events, knew that it was like a big turning point, a big shift in the way that the world was becoming organized, and they were documenting it for us now.
Taylor?
And I think, I think when we go back to the positive history, we see the source and the wisdom for how we should organize today. If you look at atrocities, you maybe can learn from them what not to do, but we can't really learn what to do. And ultimately, from these early peace activists, we saw the proliferation of institutions like the Permanent Court of Arbitration, the Permanent Court of International Justice that became the ICJ today. And we saw, if we look back at the different conferences, they were able to organize women and people all over the world to sort of come to these ideas that we still need to learn from, that haven't been fully executed.
Yeah, and again, I mention again the proceedings of the 1904 International Peace Congress. These happened all over the world, and just at the end of that book, you can see all of the different peace organizations from all over the world that came together and had these discussions. And this is 1904. I do want to say a wrinkle in all of this, and that is flagged by one of our heroines, Bertha von Suttner, is the fragility of memory, both of the individual and of the public, and she flags that. And I just want to mention, the Permanent Court of Arbitration, which is the first international court, although some people say it's not a court proper, but whatever. We won't get into that. It's because there's not, appointed judges. There are a panel of arbitrators from which you can choose, but whatever. They called it the Permanent Court of Arbitration. And Article 26 of the statute that lays out the Permanent Court of Arbitration says before, like if a state sees that two other states may engage in conflict, they have to remind the other states that this court exists, so that they need not, solve their problems with violence. That there's this, P.S. Remember, there's this other process.
I love that.
And I know. I just that just freaks me out that that's in there. But I mean, I don't know if we remember to do that. And this goes back to what Randy's like trust in doing what you said you would do. But the problem is we forget. I mean, we forget what we said we would do, or we're not taught about all of this, and that's part of the problem. I'm also reminded of the United States had a treaty with Korea from 1882, and Article 1 of that treaty says, if any country acts unjustly or oppressively towards Korea or the U.S., like the signatory of this treaty has a duty to use good offices, that is, to sort of intervene and stop the other country. So it's kind of like if like a bully is bullying one of the signatories, the other signatory has a duty to stop the bully. So in this case, it's like Japan is bullying Korea, and therefore the United States has a duty to stop and talk to Japan. So this is in Article 1. And so beginning in 1905, there's this attempt to get the United States to honor its treaty obligations. And one of my favorites, Homer Holbert, goes to the State Department from Korea. He's sent by the Emperor of Korea, and he points out to, I'm sorry to say, it's Elihu Root, the irony here. It's just the yang to the yin. But it's Elihu Root, who's the Secretary of State at the time. And Homer Holbert is Article 1, and you know what Elihu Root says? He says, I didn't know that was there. I didn't know that was there. I mean, I don't know if that's true, but and even after he learns about it, nothing is done. But anywho, this is part of the problem as well, and memory is also a part of the organization that needs to happen. And this is, I think, yeah.
Well, I'll pick that up. I think that we're highlighting something that has become a much bigger problem today than it perhaps was 100 years ago, but it was clearly a problem 100 years ago, which is that there's simply too much to remember, right? I mean, we're in a world today where many of the laws that make it through the United States Congress are longer than the J.R. Tolkien book, right? How could anyone ever take that much information into their mind and store it in a way that's, you know, at hand when a situation like this arises? And the only way for that would be to have these organizational structures in place that filter the obligations down into small packages. And that takes an enormous amount of rational and an enormous amount of intellectual labor that we're in the process of doing, and we're in the process of subverting. And so it's amazing to me. Like, there's this information overload. It's getting worse and worse. And yet, we must remember certain things. And so, in some sense, our duty, our job, is to find the staple gun to take certain ideas and force them in, you know. And I know that's what I'm trying to do.
I think when hearing about or being reminded of the Korea story, there's a quote on the bottom of page 9. Means that is, there can be peace only as there is organization, adequate, rational machinery to take the place of war when nations fall out with each other. And I think there was so much wisdom by Mead about the fact that it can't just be diplomacy, it can't just be a treaty that's not followed. There has to really be law and justice for peace. That as we organize, we need peace through law, not just peace through diplomacy.
And on this Korea story, what I find striking is that, you know, this appeal of Korea to the rest of the world to, like, you know, and Korea is always trying to use this rational machinery. They're always trying to use good offices, or at the end of World War I, self-determination, the League of Nations. They're always appealing to these more noble ideas that we see coming into international relations in the late 1800s. And so in 1919, as the Treaty of Versailles is being negotiated, the Koreans organize a nonviolent democratic uprising on the peninsula to as like a shout out to the other democracies in the world, because at that point it was like the rational machinery of diplomacy, of just like envoys going to envoys, wasn't working. So it was like, okay, well then let's use this democratic process of people doing a shout out to other people. And it was, you know, that's how it was planned. And indeed, like, the American people, some of them heard and acted and organized. And so this is a you know, a part of positive history that also, like, this is not included in our education, right? So this is one of the things that we try to work on in getting the story out. So yeah, this machinery that you're talking about in this quote, the rational machinery could be like, you know, like organized people in a democracy. And I think what you see now, you know, like with George Floyd, it's like that is what's happening with people just taking a picture. The police are lying, and so this is what causes justice, right? So this using the organized people to stop the injustice. Sadly, there's destruction going on, and this is cause for concern. We have a lot of work to do here, but yeah. Anybody else who wants to comment, go ahead.
Yeah. there's another, pocket of history that somehow gets left out of the history books that I'd like to do a touch and go on. It's very much in line with this idea of attempting to appeal to the rational, noble side of our nature. And so in 1915, there was this tremendously organized group of women who were they were trying to prevent or stop, because it had already started at that point. They were trying to stop the First World War. They were in The Hague. If you Google women in The Hague, 1915, you'll get what you need. Or I'm sure we can add something to the show resources page about this. But there was this enormously organized group of people going door to door at the different embassies saying, listen, this is what you got to do. Send this. This will do something. It might not stop everything. It might not change the world immediately, but it will help. Mm-hmm. And all of that effort has been just erased, first of all. And, there's these stories like that where people were organized in ways that we no longer have any knowledge of, and they were making efforts to do things that were clearly the right things in hindsight, and all of that needs to get unearthed, uncovered, excavated, brought to the surface and cleaned off, dusted off, and brought into the public consciousness of the people today. And I know that that's sort of the objective of the work that all of us do, but I'm happy to articulate it because it sort of reinforces all of my personal choices as a human. So.
Yeah, and I just want to point out this 1915 meeting is before many women have a formal political voice, and they're still. So there's so much important history of pre 19th Amendment, which is 1920, 100 years ago. And we should just do a show on that at some point. But I just want to flag that. And I didn't really learn about the suffrage movement in this country, much less that story in my formal education. Taylor, you want to chime in?
Yeah, I remember Hope and I were in the Dutch archives and found this book from the 1899 Hague Peace Conference.
No, you found it. You found it.
Well, we really figured out what the quote meant and a lot of the history. But Lenore Salenka had put this book together basically with women organized around the world. There were letters, there were resolutions, it was honestly just a gold mine, and it was very inspirational. And I think that that was kind of buried away in an archive, and sometimes going off of Randy's point about how we have to dig out the history, we really literally have to sometimes go into an archive and look to find these sort of treasures of organization in the past.
Well, and I have to add to this story. You're leaving out, you left out the fact that you found it, but the other important fact is that indeed I asked you to go into the archives to look in the archives of the 1907 Hague Peace Conference. And why? Because women were organized in this is before 1915, okay? And they sent, the International Council of Women sends a delegation to the 1907 Hague Peace Conference, and they meet with the secretary of the conference, and they give him a resolution, which is awesome. And the secretary of the conference says, I promise that I will share this with the delegates of the conference. And I looked in the proceedings a lot for what I could find without going into the Dutch National Archives, and I didn't see him sharing this resolution with the conference. So I asked you to go into the 1907 Hague Peace Conference archives, which I don't know if you recall, but it's like hundreds of boxes.
Yeah. I remember.
and the book that you found is from the 1899 Hague Peace Conference. It's misfiled. It wasn't supposed to, or maybe it is. Maybe somebody put in there on purpose. But I mean, that's the thing. I just think that's striking. And you did find it, and it's back there. Like, we didn't tell anyone. It's still in the 1907 boxes. But I mean, even if you go into an archive, like, it's not the case that it's kept organized. So, anyway.
Well, that's a beautiful example, one of probably 1,000 that we will uncover as this podcast continues, examples of this invisible hand that operates in order to help us educate ourselves. That term invisible hand is normally reserved for economic conversations and free market capitalism conversations, but it applies very much to this subject as far as I can tell, because some of the ways in which peace history has been kept alive is absolutely miraculous. And I very much am looking forward to stitching together some of those miracles in the future.
Yeah, fittingly, Marcus Aurelius says something on this, and not about peace history proper, but about, and he doesn't use the phrase invisible hand. He uses a phrase like ancient thread of causality, or the thread of causes. And he says this: a horse runs, a hound tracks, bees make honey, and a man does good, but he doesn't know that he has done it, and passes to a second act, like a vine to bear once more its grapes in due season. So, in other words, there's this and there's an article, I'm forgetting where it's from, but it's called something like "The Invisible Forces Behind the Arbitration Movement." It's something like this. And so the foot soldiers again are conscious of this thread of causes or ancient thread of causality that's at work, and it does seem miraculous when you encounter it. Indeed. I'll just open it up there.
Yeah. Well, I can riff for a very long time on the number of things that I've personally experienced since I discovered this international story and this wider understanding of history. Ever since my personal recognition of myself as a citizen of the world has started. Right, the relationship between the miraculous has started to weave itself in and connected me historically with many of these stories in ways that I couldn't have possibly imagined. And so, yeah.
So there's this intentional organization that we have to do, and we have 90 seconds left. So we've come to this point where we've been talking about intentional organization at the international, domestic, and individual level, but there seems to be this unintentional, or I don't know what you want to call it, but there's this other thing going on to move things along or help. Providence is what our founding fathers called it. So the invisible hand, etc. Taylor, you have the last word because you haven't said. You got 60 seconds. Any final thoughts here?
When we looked at reading this essay, I think it was clear that there was so much that began in the past, and we have so much work to continue doing. But there's a lot of positive stories and a lot of inspiration that can be drawn from the past and how we organize in the future.
All right. Well said. We'll leave it at that. Thank you so much. You've been listening to Virtues of Peace. We will be back in about a week, I hope. So stay safe and stay sane and say goodbye. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks again, Hope.
Bye.